My name is Margaret Albright, and for 65 years, I believed my legacy was measured in lesson plans and the quiet, steady rhythm of a life spent in service. I was a teacher. For 42 years, I stood in front of classrooms at Oakwood Elementary, shaping young minds with phonics and fractions, with stories of pioneers and the periodic table. My retirement party 3 years ago was a blur of construction paper cards, a lumpy ceramic apple, and the warm, weary feeling of a job well done. My colleagues, my family, toasted to my years of patience, my dedication. They had no idea that the patience they admired was a cage I had built for myself, brick by brick, year by year, that it was a cage constructed by my mother, Helen, a woman whose own life had been a monument to silent endurance. A woman's value, Maggie, she'd tell me, her voice thin as parchment, is in her usefulness, in her quiet strength. Don't make waves, be the calm in the storm. She'd drilled that into me as she worked her fingers to the bone as a seamstress. Her own dreams of going to college sacrificed on the altar of necessity. I became a teacher because it was a good, stable career. I lived in the same small, comfortable house for 40 years because it was sensible. I saved my money, drove a reliable car, and wore simple, classic clothes. I was the portrait of modest, dignified retirement. My son, David, was my greatest pride. He'd built a successful life as a graphic designer in the city, married to a vibrant, ambitious woman named Chloe. I'll admit, I was a little intimidated by Chloe at first. She was all sharp angles and dazzling smiles, a whirlwind of energy who talked about market disruptors and personal branding. She came from a world of new money and loud confidence, a world that was the antithesis of my mother's quiet strength. But she made David happy, and she'd given me my grandson, Leo, the absolute light of my life. I thought we had found a fragile, but workable piece. I was wrong. It all shattered on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday afternoon. I was at David and Chloe's modern townhouse, a sleek glass and steel structure that always felt a little too cold for my tastes. I was there to look after 7-year-old Leo while Chloe was at a crucial investor meeting. We'd just finished building an elaborate fortress out of couch cushions and blankets in the living room, and Leo was giggling, his face alight with that pure, uncomplicated joy that only children possess. I was on my hands and knees, pretending to be a troll guarding the bridge, when I heard the front door open and the sharp staccato click of Chloe's heels on the marble floor. She wasn't alone. Her parents, Richard and Beatrice Sterling, were with her. Richard was a large, florid man who always looked like he'd just closed a deal, and Beatrice was a wisp of a woman draped in silent, expensive fabrics. "Mom, we're home a little early," David called out, his voice tinged with a nervousness I couldn't place. I emerged from the cushion fortress, my knees popping, a stray piece of gray hair falling into my face. I must have looked a 65-year-old woman in rumpled khakis and a simple knit sweater, crawling on the floor. Chloe's smile was a tight, perfunctory slash of lipstick. "Oh, Margaret, you're still here." "We were just vanquishing the pillow troll," I said, trying to inject some warmth into the suddenly frigid air. Leo ran to his mother. "Mommy, Grandma built the best castle ever." Beatrice Sterling's eyes swept over me, then over the chaotic, joyful mess of the living room. Her expression was one of faint, polite disgust, as if she'd discovered a bad smell. Richard barely glanced my way, already pulling out his phone. "David, a word," Chloe said, her tone leaving no room for argument. She herded David toward the kitchen, leaving me standing there with her parents in the wreckage of our imaginary kingdom. It was then that I noticed the folder in Richard Sterling's hand, a simple, manila folder. It looked so innocuous. "Margaret," Richard began, not even bothering with pleasantries, "Chloe tells us you've been quite involved with Leo lately." "He's my grandson," I said, a defensive note creeping into my voice. "I love spending time with him." Of course," he said, his tone dismissive. "But we've been thinking about Leo's future, his real future." The boarding school in Switzerland Chloe attended, La Rosie, has an opening for next semester. It's an unparalleled opportunity. My blood ran cold. "Boarding school? He's 7. "It's never too early to build a global network," Beatrice chimed in, her voice like the tinkling of fine crystal. "The connections he'll make there, well, they're simply irreplaceable." This couldn't be happening. I looked toward the kitchen, willing David to come out and put a stop to this madness. "David and I are in complete agreement," Chloe said, emerging from the kitchen, David trailing behind her, his face pale. "It's for the best." "The best for whom, Chloe?" I asked, my voice trembling, to ship a little boy across an ocean away from his family. Richard Sterling finally looked at me, a condescending smile playing on his lips. With all due respect, Margaret, what kind of future can you really offer him? Finger painting and fairy tales. The world is a competitive place. Leo needs to be prepared. He needs advantages you simply can't provide. The words hung in the air, cruel and absolute. Advantages you simply can't provide. It was Beatrice who delivered the final, calculated blow. She stepped forward, placing a thin, manicured hand on my arm. Her touch was like ice. "Margaret, dear," she said, her voice dripping with a faux sympathy that was more insulting than her husband's bluntness. "We know you mean well. We know you love Leo. But you have to see this from our perspective. We're thinking about his legacy, about the man he will become. We don't want him influenced by a mindset of limitation. We don't want him learning to be ordinary. Ordinary." The word was a spear through the heart of everything I was, everything I had ever been taught to be. My mother's voice echoed in my head. Be useful. Be quiet. Don't make waves. I looked at David, my son. His eyes were downcast, fixed on the floor. He couldn't, or wouldn't, meet my gaze. In that moment of his profound cowardice, something in me broke. Or perhaps it was the first thing that had ever truly been set free. The quiet, patient teacher vanished. In her place stood a woman forged in a hidden fire they could never have imagined. A mindset of limitation. I repeated, my voice low and strangely calm. I looked from Beatrice's smug face to Richard's arrogant one, and finally to Chloe's triumphant expression. "You think you know what limitation is." I walked away from them, away from the pillow fort, and went to the hall closet where I'd hung my simple, worn coat. From the pocket, I took out my key. Among the keys to my house and my old sedan was a small, unassuming silver fob. It looked like a fancy USB drive. "What's that?" Chloe asked, a note of suspicion in her voice. I didn't answer. I walked over to the large, wall-mounted tablet that controlled the house's lighting, security, and entertainment system, a piece of technology I'd always pretended to find baffling. I plugged the fob into a hidden port on its side. The screen flickered, and a complex login interface appeared. My fingers, which usually fumbled with smartphone screens, flew across the keyboard with a practiced ease that made David's jaw drop. "Mom, what are you doing?" I entered a 16-digit alphanumeric password, followed by a retinal scan from a tiny poop-out lens on the fob. The screen changed, displaying a stark, minimalist dashboard. At the top, in clean, bold letters, was the name, **PALLAS Group. Richard Sterling, who had been peering at his phone, finally looked up. His face went slack. The color drained from his florid cheeks. He stammered, "The Palace Group, the venture capital firm." I turned to face them, the tablet's glow casting my face in sharp relief. I was no longer just Margaret, the retired. I was Margaret Albright, the silent, majority shareholder and founder of one of the most discreet and successful tech investment firms on the West Coast. "You were wondering about the advantages I could offer Leo," I said, my voice like steel. "Let me show you." I pulled up a portfolio summary. The numbers on the screen were astronomical. The initial seed capital came from an educational software program I developed and patented in 1998. I explained, my teacher's instinct for clear explanation taking over, even now. Albright Adaptive Learning. You might have heard of it. The school district paid me a one-time fee of $5,000 for it. I thought it was a fortune at the time. I tapped the screen. What they didn't know, what no one knew, was that I retained the underlying intellectual property. I used that $5,000 to hire a lawyer and file the patents myself. When the tech boom hit, that little piece of code became the foundation for half the educational apps on the market. The licensing royalties started as a trickle. By 2005, they were a flood. I looked directly at Richard. I reinvested every penny. I had a knack for it. I saw the potential in things others overlook, much like I see the potential in my grandson, which has nothing to do with a Swiss bank account and everything to do with a pillow fort and his grandmother's love. I pulled up another screen. This is a list of our current major holdings. You'll recognize a few names. We took an early position in Viridia Networks in 2012 and Omnistream Media in 2015. Richard Sterling made a choking sound. Omnistream. That's the company that acquired my media conglomerate last year. He stared at me, his eyes wide with a kind of terrified recognition. The board was dominated by a silent partner, a holding company called Palace. He pointed a trembling finger at me. You're the reason I was forced into early retirement. You're the silent partner. The room was utterly silent. Leo, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, had hidden behind my legs. Chloe was staring at the screen, then at me, her face a mask of sheer, uncomprehending avarice and shock. Beatrice looked as if she'd been slapped. David finally found his voice. Mom, all these years, you never said anything. Why? I turned to my son, the grief and the fury finally breaking through my calm facade. Because of this, David, because I saw what the pursuit of wealth did to people. I saw it in the parents of my students. I saw it in the world. I wanted you to have a normal life, a life built on something real, something you made for yourself. I didn't want you to be ordinary. I threw their word back at them, and it landed with the force of a hammer. I unplugged the fob, and the screen returned to its normal, domestic interface. The spell was broken, but the world had been irrevocably remade. Leo is not going to Switzerland, I said, my tone leaving no room for negotiation. He is going to have a childhood. He is going to build pillow forts, and read stories, and know that he is loved for who he is, not for the portfolio he might one day inherit. I looked at Chloe, my gaze unwavering. And you will never, ever speak to me again with the condescension you displayed today. You wanted to know about my legacy. It isn't a number on a screen. It's the thousands of children I taught to read. It's the son I raised to be a good man, a man who I hope will find the courage to stand up for his own family. And it is the grandson I will move heaven and earth to protect. I took Leo's hand. Come on, sweetheart. We're going to Grandma's house. I walked out of their cold, perfect townhouse, leaving a silence behind me that was louder than any scream. The cage door was open. I had just begun to fight. The fallout was immediate and brutal. David called me incessantly for the next 48 hours. His messages, a chaotic mix of anger, betrayal, and desperate curiosity. Chloe, after the initial shock had worn off, had shifted into full-scale damage control, which for her meant trying to figure out how to monetize this new information. 3 days after my revelation, they showed up at my modest, 3-bedroom home. It was a place they had always treated with a kind of patronizing affection, like a quaint relic. Now, they looked at it as if it were a fortress, hiding unimaginable treasures. David didn't even wait to get inside. How could you lie to me my entire life, Mom? All those times you talked about saving for retirement, about being careful with money. It was all a lie. It wasn't a lie, David, I said, holding the door open. I was careful. I was careful to ensure that money didn't define you, that it didn't distort your choices the way it's distorting them now. Chloe swept past me, her eyes scanning my living room with new, avaricious interest. Margaret, let's not be dramatic. This is a wonderful thing. This is about family. We should be working together. Working together on what, Chloe? I asked, my voice flat. On how best to access my assets. She had the decency to blush, but it was fleeting. On how to plan for our family's future. Leo's future? We should be thinking about trusts, about estate planning. We need to be strategic. Strategic, I repeated, like trying to send a 7-year-old to another continent. David ran a hand through his hair. Mom, she has a point. If what you're saying is true, we need to think about this responsibly. We can't just pretend it doesn't exist. I've been thinking about it responsibly for 30 years, David, and my responsibility right now is to protect Leo from being turned into a pawn in your wife's social claiming ambitions. Chloe's composure shattered. How dare you? I am thinking of my son's future. A future you want to relegate to this. She gestured wildly around my comfortable, book-filled home, to a life of mediocrity. Get out, I said, my voice dangerously quiet. Mom, David started. Get out of my house, both of you. They left, but the battle lines were drawn. The next week, I received a formal letter from a law firm I knew all too well, Sterling & Sterling, Richard's own firm. It was a delicately worded but unmistakable threat. It questioned my mental acuity and fitness to be involved in the life of my grandson, suggesting that my recent fantastical claims and secretive behavior were cause for concern. They were laying the groundwork to sue for grandparental rights, or rather, to restrict mine. It was the final, unforgivable blow. They weren't just coming for me, they were coming for Leo. I made 2 phone calls. The first was to my lawyer. a formidable woman named Isabella Rossi, who had been managing the legal architecture of the Palace Group for 2 decades. The second was to my head of security, a former CIA analyst named Ben Carter, who ensured my privacy remained intact. "It's time, Isabella," I said. "They've threatened Leo." "I'll draw up the papers," she replied, her voice crisp and efficient. The full financial disclosure, coupled with a restraining order based on their threats and the evidence of their financial coercion. Ben was already working. "I've found the investigator Chloe hired, Margaret, a real buck. He's been digging into your property records, your car registration, trying to find any discrepancy to use against you." "Shut him down," I said. "Already done." A few pointed words from our general counsel about the legal definition of harassment, and he's dropped them like a hot stone. I've also compiled a full dossier on Richard Sterling's current financial situation. It's precarious. His forced retirement was just the beginning. He's leveraged to the hilt, and several of his remaining investments are about to collapse. He was counting on Chloe marrying into money. He thought David was his ticket out. The pieces were all falling into place. This wasn't just about Leo's education. It was about a sinking ship. And they saw me as the life raft. The final confrontation took place in Isabella Rossi's stark, modern conference room, a world away from the cozy clutter of my home. On one side of the table, me, Isabella, and Ben. On the other, David, Chloe, and a smug-looking attorney from Sterling and Sterling. Chloe's lawyer began with the same condescending tone. "Mrs. Albright, we're here today to find an amicable solution regarding the welfare of Leo Sterling. His name is Leo Albright," I corrected him coldly, "and there is nothing to discuss. My client is concerned about the instability your recent revelations have caused. We're proposing a structured visitation schedule, supervised by a court-appointed psychologist, until your situation can be fully assessed." Isabella didn't even blink. She slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was a bank statement for one of my holding companies. The balance was just over $187 million. "This is one of 73 similar accounts," Isabella said calmly. "My client's situation is one of extreme stability. Perhaps we should discuss your client's situation." She then slid another folder across the table. It was Ben's dossier on Richard Sterling. "It seems Mr. Sterling is facing margin calls on 3 separate investments, totaling approximately $4.2 million. Isabella continued. "The primary collateral on those loans is his share of the family estate in Napa, which, according to county records, is already mortgaged to 92% of its assessed value. A foreclosure would be messy." Chloe's face was as white as the conference table. Her lawyer was frantically scanning the documents. This is irrelevant," the lawyer stammered. "Is it?" I asked, speaking for the first time. "It seems highly relevant to me. It explains why you are so desperate to get your hands on my money, that you would try to legally separate me from my grandson." David was staring at the bank statement, his face a sickly green. $187 million, he whispered. "This changes nothing," Chloe hissed, her composure gone. "You are a liar and a manipulator. You hid this from your own son. What kind of mother does that? The kind who didn't want her son to marry a woman who sees people as transactions." I shot back, my voice rising. "I saw the greed in you, Chloe, from the very beginning. I just never imagined you would be so brazen as to try and sell my grandson's childhood for a line of credit." The meeting devolved into chaos after that. Accusations flew. Tears were shed mostly from Chloe. Tears of rage and thwarted ambition. Through it all, I sat perfectly still, my mother's voice finally silent in my head. I was making waves, and it felt like justice. In the end, we reached an agreement, but it was on my terms. I would not pursue criminal charges for harassment or attempted extortion. In return, Chloe and her parents would sign a legally binding agreement. They would never again attempt to interfere in my relationship with Leo. They would drop all legal challenges, and they would never contact me again. I also set up a trust for Leo, a multi-million-dollar fund that would be managed by an independent trustee until he was 20. It was ironclad. Neither David nor Chloe could touch it. It was my promise to him, a future of choice, not coercion. As they left the conference room, defeated and silent, David lingered. "Why, Mom?" he asked again, his voice hollow. "Why didn't you trust me?" "It was never about trust, David," I said, my heart aching for the boy he had been. "It was about protection. I was trying to protect you from a world that measures a man by his net worth. I failed. But I will not fail, Leo." He left without another word. The distance between us felt like a canyon dot in the months that followed. I finally began to live the life I had only ever secretly dreamed of. I didn't buy a yacht or a private jet. I sold my quiet little house and bought a beautiful, light-filled property on a few acres of land just outside the city, with a big, messy garden and a tree perfect for a treehouse. I established the Helen Foundation, named for my mother, not to celebrate her quiet endurance, but to fund scholarships for women over 50 who wanted to go back to school, to start businesses, to finally make some noise. My relationship with David is still a work in progress. He brings Leo to my new home every weekend. The first time Leo saw the tree, he screamed with joy. We built that tree house together, just the two of us, our hands covered in sap and sawdust. It's our castle now, far better than any pillow fort. Duffet watches us sometimes, a complicated look on his face. There's hurt there, still, but there's also a dawning respect. He's starting to see that the mother he thought he knew was only a fraction of the whole woman. He's starting to understand that strength isn't always quiet, and that love isn't about providing a quiet, limited life, but about providing the freedom to live an extraordinary one. The other day, as we were staining the deck of the treehouse, Leo looked up at me, his small face serious. "Grandma," he said, "are we rich?" I put down my paintbrush and looked at him, at the simple, profound joy in his grass-stained knees and his bright eyes. "Yes, sweetheart," I said, pulling him into a hug. "We are rich in all the ways that truly matter." I had spent a lifetime being quiet, being useful, being the calm in the storm, but I've learned that sometimes the most useful thing you can be is a force of nature. Asterisk, asterisk, what silent strength are you ready to unleash? Share your story below. I read every comment. Asterisk, asterisk.